about the creator, James. Like we said that we talked about how it was your first main production designer job of a film that came out. And working with Gareth was the first time. Despite all the similar interests that you guys had in in films that you've watched or you've grown up with, or the visuals and the vision, do you remember a moment when things weren't a challenge essentially, where things weren't going as you had hoped, in terms of whether it was designing something or working on a particular scene? If you have a story to share about that, it's not necessarily anything controversial. I just love listening to things,
Sure.
problems, and then trying to find a solution to it, because that's what it's all about.
Yeah, I mean, there are many cases where you know it's that kind of blank page syndrome of like, oh my God, we've got this whole scene to work out. How do we do it? And one of the more complicated ones was towards the end of the film where Joshua and Alfie are trying to escape in this escape pod, and there's
Mm,
multiple kind of chambers. There's the escape pod, there's this main chamber, there's like an airlock where Joshua has to get air back, or oxygen. There's some tentacle creature that comes down. Now, in an earlier edit, that was a much more expanded scene, but you can still see the amount of complexity that came into, okay, how do they come into this room? How do they get to the end of the room and are able to? Alfie has to go turn on the oxygen again. She has to start up the escape pod and all the systems of starting it up. There's a door that has to come down.
mm-hmm.
All of that stuff was in the script, but it wasn't so detailed that I can just start designing the space. It had to require Gareth and I getting on Zoom call after Zoom call of like, okay, well, is this thing here? Maybe this whole thing rotates and new escape pods kind of rotate down into place so you can load in and drop another one in. How does that play into the sequence? How does that play into the emotional context of it all? And there was a lot of just me kind of sketching in front of Gareth on a Zoom call, like copy pasting industrial spaces with really crude sketches of what this could look like. We knew Gareth knows that because of his VFX background and just filmmaking background, he knows that he doesn't need everything completely fleshed out initially. It could
Yeah.
look like I did so many really bad, rough sketches that if he found what he needed in it, if it worked shot wise or it worked visually for him, he wouldn't sweat then having to get into the details. We'd kind of put it aside and then move on to something else. But that whole airlock sequence
Yep.
was a real brain twister. And the other one was the Nomad itself, that big kind of flying bird of prey, U.S. military bird of death kind of thing.
Yep.
Um, we didn't really, it was just kind of described as a bit of a space station that could kind of float above Earth and kind of, target different locations. The actual look of it, we just didn't have any idea. It was just, again, we had the benefit of the pandemic. Our production was actually supposed to start to shoot in the spring of 2020 when the pandemic really kicked
Yep.
off. So unfortunately, we couldn't shoot then, but there was money for Gareth and I to jump on Zoom calls once in a while and spend a few hours together and try to kind of work some stuff out. And one of the big ones was that Nomad, and trying to understand not only what it looked like, but how it functioned, where the targeting systems came down, where the missiles were loaded, all that stuff. Um, but we went through hundreds and hundreds of sketches and ideas of what that thing could look like before we arrived at what you saw in the film. Um, yeah, and then that collaboration is what helped keep a little bit of the production down, the budget down. We worked very kind of smaller teams than typical. We had a little bit more time to kind of work together one-on-one rather than huge teams of people
Right.
trying to push it forward. It was important to Gareth to work kind of hands-on and as intimate as possible with all the filmmakers. It allows him more freedom, and it allows him to not have to think about the logistics of everything. It lets him be creative. So
Yeah.
it's one of the big things we tried to keep going, was the kind of one-on-one contact, not only with myself, but with all the filmmakers.